For those of you who are here, I just want to do a quick to get you guys to do the partials. What's the partial of y with respect to x? 5. I guess I'm doing this with the wrong people then. Okay. With z? Perfect. You knew that. Okay, with respect to x? Okay. And with respect to z? Okay, that was easy. Okay, so I'm going to start. I guess there's no way to do it just right. So this is the way I have to do it so I can make the video. So the video will stay on one slide and it won't go to the next one. Okay. So today we start on consumer theory, right? And the slide says, pretty much when we talk about consumers or agents in general, firms, whatever they might be, we're going to assume they have a goal, right? An objective. When we do it mathematically, that's going to be the objective function, right? But there's limitations, right? We talked about last time. The limitation for the consumers is budget, right? Again, we all want the big house on the hill, the yachts, everything else, but for most of us, we can't afford that stuff. So what we want to do is we want to define the goals, right? In line with the constraints and see how the consumer behaves. We'll change certain items, maybe in the goals or in the constraints, or something external, like maybe a sales tax, an increase in price, and see how the consumer behaves to compare the statics. Okay. So we're going to do this in 3 different ways, right? The most traditional is to assume that there's something called utility or satisfaction, and we're going to call it utility. Right? Consumers get satisfaction from engaging in certain economic activities, right? That means buying stuff and consuming them. In other words, I don't get utility per se from the item. I get my utility from consuming the item, right? So we're going to have, therefore, a utility function, right, that measures the amount of satisfaction or utility that they get from different items. And we're going to assume that instead of just item by item, we're going to do baskets of goods. The consumer picks a basket of goods and say there's infinite baskets of goods, or in this case, n basket of goods, and the consumer chooses that basket that maximizes his utility, right? So the basket of good would be n goods or n baskets, right? We can denote it with the vector. Everybody in here knows what a vector is? Yeah, it's a 1 by n matrix, and graphically you can denote it from just array or a line from the origin out forward, whether it's 2-dimensional or 3-dimensional. So this vector, right, we're going to call it x underscore, and it has all of the baskets of goods in it, right? If we have it on 2-dimensional space, it's just a dot, right? It's called Euclidean space. Okay, so basically we can take that vector, that basket of goods, right, that we consume, right, and that's going to give us a real number. Right? So the basket of So the goal of the agent would be to choose the bundle that gives them the greatest utility, right? For this class, most of the time, we're going to assume that the utility function is monotone. It's not a realistic assumption, but it helps because if you consume too much of something, eventually it's really going to give you disutility. You're not going to like it if you consume too much. We assume that that's not true. We assume that at some point it might level off, but it's never going to go down. The utility is never going to decrease, right? So at most, what we call marginal utility, that added utility, will be zero. And that's what monotone means. It's always increasing or staying the same. Okay. So if I had two different commodities in my basket and I draw the utility function as a height, right, and the two, excuse me, and the two goods on the other two axes, right, what we get is a mountain. Basically, as we increase those, excuse me, as we increase those two commodities, those two goods or services, right, our utility increases. We climb the mountain. And that's it graphically, right? As we get more of X1 or X2, we climb the mountain, right? And more always means that we're climbing, right? If I get more X2, I'm either going up or staying on that same level. Same thing with X2. I'm either going up or staying on that same level. Now, I take this mountain, right? And if I am staying on the same level, that means my utility is not changing, right? So I can walk around that mountain and keep my utility the same. By the same token, I can imagine cutting a slice where I walked around, right? That gave me that same utility and putting it on a two-dimensional graph with just X1 and X2. Or in other words, taking that mountain and collapsing it down, and then I have a bunch of lines that give me the same utility. Those lines that give me the same utility are known as indifference curves, right? That's because I'm indifferent between any 2 points on those curves. I'd rather be on this line than this line, but I'm indifferent between this point, X1, and this point, X2. So, there are an infinite amount of utility curves, and the farther away I am from the origin, or more northeast I go, the higher my utility. But on any one line, I'm indifferent between any 2 points on that one line. Okay. So, any two bundles, like I said, X1 or X2 on the same indifference curve, give me the same level of utility. I can write that as UX1 equals UX2. My utility from those two, excuse me, from those two baskets of goods, or those two, in this case, two commodities, give me the same utility, or the same, actually, two baskets of goods, right? So an indifference curve, therefore, consists of a set of X underscore. Remember, X underscore is our vector of different baskets. So U of X bar equals U naught, where U naught is constant. Okay. So I can write that utility function as follows. U, actually, let me. Initially, what I want to write is U and I'm going to define that in the identity as U naught, where U naught is constant. Since U naught is constant, what I can do is I can rewrite X2 as a function of X1, right? So this is what I get. I get U X1, right? X2 or X2 is a function of X1 and U naught, because I have to stay on that same indifference curve, or I have to keep utility constant. So basically, with constant utility, X1 and X2, if I increase one, that implies I have to decrease the other, right? So what I do, then once I have this function, is I go ahead and I take the total differential with respect to X1. right? So I get u, or the partial of u with respect to x1, right? Plus the partial of x2 with respect to x1, x1 affects x2, and multiplied by the function of u with respect to x2. So x1 affects x2, x2 affects utility. So this is why we do the chain rule on this partial. And of course, the identity, right, where u naught is a constant, so therefore we know the partial rule of u naught is 0, right? So taking this, right, and rewriting it, for instance, I might want to solve for x2 over x1, right? And when I solve for the partial of x2 with respect to x1, what I get is negative the partial of u with respect to x1 divided by the partial of u with respect to x2. Of course, here on the slide, I denoted as u1 and u2, where u1 is the partial of u with respect to x1, and u2 is the partial, excuse me, of u2 with respect to x2. Okay. ¿Tiene preguntas? Ok, perfecto. Hacemos los ejercicios de unos parciales nomás para comenzar. Y pues, yo sabía que íbamos a hacer este ejercicio, pues por eso la hice. Aquí lo que tengo es una función de u, utilidad, esa es satisfacción, que es función de x1, x2. Y la ponemos igual a un constante, porque eso quiere decir que nos da el mismo nivel de utilidad, de satisfacción. Y vimos que cuando tengo el mismo nivel, si tengo x1 y x2, tenemos una curva de indiferencia. En cada punto, en esa curva, la utilidad es igual. Eso quiere decir que es constante. Entonces, como la utilidad es constante, ¿verdad? El derivado es 0. Entonces, yo tomo el parcial a respecto de x1, y también, como esto es igual a un constante y x1 y x2 son las únicas cosas hay, si x1 sube, x2 necesita bajar para mantener la utilidad fija. Entonces, eso quiere decir que yo puedo escribir x2 en términos de x1 y un 0. I could have done the same thing with x1. But... Entonces, tomo el parcial de u a respecto de x1, más el parcial de 1 a respecto de x2, más el parcial de x2 a x1. Eso quiere decir que esta es la regla de cadena, donde x1 afecta a x2, y entonces x2 afecta a utilidad. Como un 0 es constante, perdón, el derivado es 0. Entonces hago un poquito de álgebra y resuelvo por el parcial de x2 a respecto de x1, y veo que yo tengo ese es igual a la razón de los parciales de utilidad respecto a los x, x1 y x2. So I have, right, the slope on my two-dimensional curve with x1 and x2 equaling the ratio of partials of utility with respect to x1 and x2. Right? So it tells me the slope of the indifference curve is equal to the ratio of additional utility you get from one good relative to the other. It tells me how much of good 2 I need in order to replace the unit of good 1. So if I have less of good 1, how much more of good 2 do I need to make it up and stay on that same indifference curve? In other words, keep the utility the same. So it tells me the rate at which I'm willing to trade one good for the other. So if the slope is flat, it tells me that in order to give up 1 unit of the vertical good, I need to give up a lot of the horizontal good. The opposite's true. Sorry, I don't remember if I did this. Yes, I did. Okay. I wasn't sure if I presented to everyone. I'm not sure if Zahili is watching us now or not, but at least she's connected. Okay. So it tells me the trade-off. If the slope is flat, it tells me that in order to give up 1 unit of the vertical good, I need to give up a lot of the horizontal good. If it's steep, right, in order to get another unit of the horizontal good, I have to give up a lot of the vertical good. So how I value one good relative to the other depends on where I am, right, in the space or on the indifference curve, and in particular on the proportions of the goods in the bundle. Okay. The ratio that I'm willing to give up one good for another, right, we're going to define as the marginal rate of substitution. If I give up 1 unit of good one, how much utility do I lose? And the answer is I lose a level of utility equal to U1, the partial of our utility function with respect to X1. And how many units of good 2 do I need to make up for that loss of utility? And I need the marginal rate of substitution. I need the ratio U1 divided by U2. So the marginal rate of substitution is the slope of our indifference curve, right? At a certain point. So basically in our with convexity, right? Up over here, it will really steep, and down here, right, really flat. It depends where we at is how much of good one I have to give up for good two. And that makes sense because if I have a lot of good one and a little bit of good two, well, more than likely I'd probably want a little bit more of good two, and I'd be willing to give up more of X1, or vice versa if I'm down in the bottom, right? So, for example, suppose the partial of u with respect to X1 is 10, and the partial of u with respect to X2 is 5. If I give up 1 unit of good one, I lose 10 units of utility. In order to make that up, I need 2 units, 5 plus 5, right, of good 2 to get those 10 units. So in that case, right, the marginal rate of substitution is going to be 2. That's what I need to give. That's what I need to. I'm sorry. Did I do it wrong? I have U1 over U2, right? Yeah. So 10 over 5, 2. But if I ask this on a test, right? It just depends how you label the graph. So you can do it. Yeah. If I switch the axes, then yes, you would be right. Okay. Examples of utility curves. In general, that utility curve, I'm sorry, that indifference curve. In general, we think that a normal utility curve or normal indifference curve, but there might be other shapes. That makes it easier to work with, and it's also realistic in that utility curve, that indifference curve. I was doing it 3 times in a row now. That indifference curve shows diminishing marginal rates of substitution. In other words, it shows that if I'm up top, I need to give up a lot of good 2 for excuse me, for 1 unit of good 1, and down here just the opposite. You give up a lot of good 1 for 2. That's what we think they usually look up, but there's other indifference curves. Suppose we have 2 goods that are interchangeable, right? That I really don't care which of the goods I get, they're pretty much the same. that would be a substitute, or they're substitutes for one another, and I'm indifferent between the two. So in that case, right, my indifference curve would look like that. Or it doesn't have to be 1 for 1, it can be 2 for 1 or 3 for 1. But the point is I can substitute this for that, and it makes no difference to me, right? So therefore your indifference curve would look flat. The other is complements. Of course, this would be a perfect substitute, right? We can have things that have some degree of substitution and still look like this and still have our diminishing marginal rate of substitution. This is perfect complement. The only example that I've ever heard of a perfect complement is shoes, right? It doesn't matter how many left shoes I have, it doesn't do any good with the other one. So I can be up here and I have 10 right shoes and only one left shoe. Well, I'm including the same. I mean, I really don't know. The same thing here. So complements look like that, and of course, as I told you, this is what we think of a normal indifference curve that shows diminishing marginal rates of substitution, right? In other words, what that means is I consume more, my added utility from consuming that extra good, right, or that extra unit is less than the unit before. Okay. So we have our indifference curve, and we haven't really finished with the indifference curve. We're going to show you why we're going to assume that it's convex to the origin, and we're going to show what happens when it's not convex to the origin, right? Okay, so, or at least not convex throughout its entire, excuse me, throughout its entire domain or range. Okay, but now what I want to talk about is the constraint. For the consumer, it's the budget. Okay, so let's say I have two goods, ham and eggs. It can be any two goods, right? I have my income, the price of good one and the price of good two, right? And we have our vector, x underscore, right? Where x underscore is a vector of these two goods, x1 and x2. So what that means is my income, I can buy x1 times p1 a good one, plus p2 times x2 a good two, and it has to be at least, or excuse me, it has to be less than the income I have. So it has to be less than or equal to the income I have. Now later on, we're going to assume that the consumer doesn't save and he spends all of it. That makes it easier. Plus, we're doing comparative statics. We're doing a one-period model. So we do that to simplify things. Okay. By the way, that vector, right? I can draw as p underscore, where p is the vector of prices, times x underscore, right? Less than or equal to I, where that p underscore x underscore was just a summation, just like instead of having just two x, p1 plus x2 plus p2 times x2, then I'd have plus p3 times x3 plus p, and so on. And I just multiply the vectors by each other and I get that. But that's just notation, it's not that big a deal. Okay. So, and another way of writing the same thing is your budget is a function of the vector of prices, or all the prices, and your income. Where x underscore, where b equals x underscore, given that the vector of prices times the vector of goods is less than or equal to your income. On a two-dimensional graph, all that is a line, right? So initially I have, if I assume they're equal, p1, x1 plus P2 X2 equals I. And I want to solve for, let's say, I have 2 here, so I'm going to solve for X2. So X2 equals I over P2 minus P1 X1 over P2, right? So that means the intercept on this curve is just I over P2. That means if I only buy X2, that's how much I can buy, I over P2. Now, okay, over here, it will be the same thing, I over P1. The slope of this graph, right? I can rewrite this. I can write it like this, where this is the slope. So the slope of our budget line is simply the ratio of prices. And I put a plus there. So that's the slope of our budget line, the ratio of prices. Okay. So if I spend all my income, right, which I assumed when I put the equal and sign instead of the less than be and sign, right? I can afford anything on the budget line or below, right? The slope of the budget line tells me how much more units of good 2 I can buy if I buy 1 less unit of good 1. Another way of saying this is opportunity cost in terms of good 2 of consuming a unit of good 1, just a ratio of prices. And at the corners we saw it's just I spend all my money on that one good, I over P2 or I over P1. Okay. So suppose I have my budget line and I have my indifference curves, right? Suppose I start at point A. Well, at point A, right, if I move up and to the left, right, I can get to a different budget line. So I'm sorry, a different indifference curve, or a higher indifference curve. So if I have here, I can move up and I can get to a higher indifference curve. If I keep moving that way, right, there's going to be a point where I can't get to a higher indifference curve anymore. Right? And once I'm here at point B, right, where the 2 lines are tangent, I can't get to a higher indifference curve. If I continue moving up, I'm going to end up at a lower indifference curve. So at that point, right, is where I'm maximizing utility when I spend all my money, right, at point B. And at that point, the 2 lines are tangent. What that means is they have the same slope. They're just barely touching and they have the same slope. Now, we know what the slope of the indifference curve is. We talked about it a little bit ago. It's the marginal rate of substitution. It's the partial of u with respect to x1 plus the partial of u with respect to x2, right? And we know what the slope of our budget line is. It's just the ratio of prices. So we can just set those 2 things equal. Okay. So at point A, I know that U1 divided by U2 is less than the ratio of prices P1 over P2. Okay. Right? This slope, right, is flatter than the slope of the indifference curve. So So that ratio is less, right? Since the indifference curve U1 over U2 is flatter at the budget line and P1 over P2 is steeper. In other words, the marginal rate of substitution is less than the opportunity cost or the ratio prices. U1 over U2 is the amount of good 2 that I need in order to replace that of good 1. And P1 over P2 is how much of good 2 I can buy if I give up one unit of good 1. So this tells me that if I give up a unit of good 1, I can get more of good 2, and this will provide me with more utility. So basically, here I have to give up good 1 and get more of good 2. Okay. So this means I can do better by consuming less of good 1 and more of good 2. I can increase my utility by giving up some of good 1 and moving the direction of the arrow until I reach point B. At point B, right, the two slopes are equal. The marginal rate of substitution is equal to the ratio of prices. And the budget line and the difference curve are tangent. At that point, I can't do better. I'm maximizing my utility given my constraint and given my budget. Okay. So in other words, if I face fixed prices, I'm going to adjust the amount of goods 1 I consume until at the margin I value the goods myself in the same way as opportunity costs or the ratio of prices. So given constant prices, I'm going to adjust my consumption, in this case of ham and eggs, until I value ham and eggs in the same way the market does. Right? After everybody adjusts their consumption and spend more on ham and eggs, everybody will end up valuing ham and eggs, right, at the same rate the market does because those are the prices they face. Right? Not everybody will consume the same amount. Some people consume more ham, some people consume more eggs. But at the margin, they all value ham and eggs the same. Right? People achieve this in different ways, as I told you. So my marginal rate of substitution between ham and eggs is the same as everybody else's, same as yours, anybody who's buying ham and eggs, right? Because we say we face the same prices. That doesn't mean that you might like ham and eggs a lot more than I do. That means you'll be, if we had the same utility functions, you'd be on a higher indifference curve than mine. But at the margin rate of substitution is always going to equal the rate of prices, even though you might buy a lot more ham and eggs than I do. At the margin, right, we value them the same. Okay. The next, that is, unless we have what is called a corner solution. What that means is I really like ham and I hate eggs. I'm not going to buy any eggs. I'm just going to buy ham. Right? Well, in that case, I'd be up here at point A, right? And at point A, the slope of the indifference curve doesn't have to equal the slope of the budget line. In other words, marginal rate of substitution doesn't have to equal to the rate of prices. In fact, I'd probably give up more eggs. I'd give up more eggs if I had them to get more ham, but I don't have it, so I'm stuck there at that point. Right? And that's a corner solution. That's the one place in this where the marginal rate of substitution does not have to equal the ratio of prices. Okay. So the best this person can do is consume at point A. However, at that point, the slopes are not equal, right? U1 over U2 is less than the ratio of prices. I would give up more of good 2 to get more of good 1, but I don't have any of good 1 to, I should give up some of good 1 to get more of good 2, but I have no good 1 to offer, right? So for all goods that the individual consumes in positive amounts, in other words, I'm not at the corner solution, I'm not consuming 0, right? The individual values them in the same rate as the market. Okay. Okay, so that's one of the ways we're measuring. Now we're going to talk about another, right? And we're going to talk about these preferences. So we've used the ratio of marginal utilities, a good 1 and good 2, right? We have not talked about the magnitude, right? It doesn't matter because we're talking about ratios. The magnitude of the amount of satisfaction, remember that measures of utility are not important, rather the ranking of the bundles, or in this case, right, our baskets of goods is what matters. So let's assume that I change the utility function in such a way that I keep the same indifference curves. I can do that by taking any positive monotone transformation of the function of u, defined as a function such that the derivative of f with respect to u is greater than 0 to transform the old utility measures into a new one. So basically what I'm doing is I'm taking my utility function, I'm transforming it, and I'm getting a new utility function, but no matter how many baskets of goods I have with that transformation, I still prefer them in the same order. That's all it is. And if I can get this monotonic transformation from this to V, and we're going to do this next week when we go from our utility functions to something known as an indirect utility function, which instead of utility from the goods, we get utilities indirectly from prices and income. But like I said, that's next week. But anyway, this is a monotonic transformation of a utility function, right? So bundles with whatever got higher levels of utility in UX also gets higher level of utility with VX underscore. And the two bundles of A and B subject to U of A equal U of B means that V of A equals V of B. Therefore, the indifference curves don't change. To be sure, the measures of utility to their heights will change, but bundles on whatever was the same indifference curve height before will continue to be the same now, right? So therefore, the marginal rate of substitution, since our indifference curves are the same, doesn't change, whether I'm measuring in V's or I'm measuring in U's. Now, why am I telling you this? If I can transform my utility function monotonically, what that means is I really don't need a utility function. And if I can think of those preferences acting like they have a utility function and change them monotonically, I definitely don't need a utility function. So instead of thinking about the individuals having a utility function, we can think of them as having preference ordering. In other words, now all those baskets of goods that we ordered and then we transformed into the same order, well, we can think of it the same way now, right? So I can talk about x1 underscore being as good as x2 underscore, where that kind of, it's not really a greater than sign, it's kind of a duckbill or whatever, or means just as good as. So under certain conditions, we can find an ordinal utility function. Remember, ordinal means we're just ranking bundles. We're ordering them, right? We have an ordinal utility function that gives us the same information as a preference ordering. If I can get the same information with either technique, I don't lose anything by describing preferences by utility function. The three conditions that these preferences have to meet for the existence of such a utility function are the following. First of all, the ordering of the preferences are complete. This means that I can compare any two bundles that either x1 is at least as good as x2 or x2 is at least as good as x1, right? But I can't have them both, right? Otherwise, that makes no sense. So that's number one. Number two is something known as transitivity. So if I have three or more bundles, right? If x1 is just as good as x2 and x2 is just as good as x3, then x1 has to be just at least as good as x3, right? I can't have loops, so if I reverse this and I have x3 being better than x1 when x1 was greater than x2 and x2 was greater than x3, then it would fall apart. We wouldn't have transitivity, we'd have a loop. But it has to go in order, right? From best to worst. Suppose that I have criteria for judging goods. In order to make the decision, I take a vote within myself. Let's say the order of my preference under each criteria is following. I like A better than B, or I like A just as good as B or better, B just as good as C or better. B is just as good as C, and C is just as good as A. That doesn't work, right? Because I like A up here better, and then of course C is greater than A, and A is greater than B. Again, that doesn't work. So if A is better than B and B is better than C, C can't be better than A. Or if I have that, transitivity fails, and right, our our way of doing this by ordinal utility doesn't work, right? And finally, continuity and continuity. Thank you. Continuity. Sorry, I'm tongue-tied. Imagine if I was doing this in Spanish. Okay. What that means is if I have my preference ordering, then and I have transitivity, right? There exists an alpha, right, between 1 and 0, where alpha A plus 1 minus alpha C is indifferent to B. So I can get a linear combination of A and B, I'm sorry, A and C that's at least as good as B, right? It doesn't give me the same utility as B. So we can think of, when we look at our, even though we're not doing this with utility functions, if we were doing it this ordering way, and I had A, B, B, and C, right? I can draw a straight line from A and C that's going to be just as good as B, right? Okay. So now our problem, right, is going back to utility. I have a utility function that's a function of x1 and x2, subject to our budget constraint, p1 x1 plus p2 x2 is less than or equal to our budget I, or our income. And we also have the following, that I can't consume x1 or x2 in negative amounts, right? It's either 0 or positive. Most of the time when we have these, I'm not even going to show these as a constraint. I'm just going to assume that x1 or 2 has to be non-negative. Okay. So having my objective function subject to my constraint, in this case constraints, right? Suppose I want to solve a problem where I want to maximize ux2 and spend all my income, right? In other words, make it equal instead of a less than sign. To solve this problem, we are going to form something known as Lagrangian expression. Lagrange was just a French mathematician that came up with this to solve a objective function with the constraint. So I rewrite the constraint as I minus p1 x1 minus p2 x2. Therefore, we write the Lagrangian as follows. Actually, we do it. And usually, U, X1, X2, plus lambda, which is known as the Lagrangian multiplier minus constraint I minus P1 X1 minus P2 X3. This is our Lagrangian. So once I have the Lagrangian, right, I want to calculate what's known as our first order conditions. And what that means is I have three unknowns here. I'm assuming I know what it is. That means I don't know which one and I don't know. So what I need to do is take partial derivatives with all three of those random variables. And once I do that, I'm going to have three equations, three first order conditions, and three unknowns, right? If I have as many unknowns as I have equations, I can solve it. Okay. Now, actually, let me do it up here on the board. So the partial of lambda with respect to x1 is u1 plus lambda p1, sorry, minus lambda p1. And then second with respect to x2, and I get u2, or u2 again is a partial u with respect to x2, minus lambda p2, and finally with respect to lambda. The partial of lambda with respect to lambda gives me I minus P1 x1 minus P2 x2. Now, what I'm looking for is to optimize my objective function here. To do that, I have to set all of these first order conditions equal to 0. And once I set them equal to 0, since I'm maximizing, right, I can solve for my three unknowns. Okay. Now I have to take the second derivative to know if this is a maximum or minimum, maximizing utility and not minimizing it. But in general, for tests and stuff, if I'm giving you a utility function, just assume it's a maximum. You don't have to take the second order derivative. Usually takes too long. And you spend your whole test doing that instead of onto the other questions. So the easiest way to solve this, and that I found, this is math. You can do it 100 different ways. So lambda here, right, will equal u2 over p2, and lambda here will equal u1 over p2. Right? And those both equal lambda, so I can set them equal to each other. I have lambda equals u1 over p1 plus lambda equaling u2 over p2. Right? So it's right in here. So I can rewrite this equation, now that I set them equal to each other, as follows. U1 over U2 is equal to P1 over P2. which is what we did graphically, right? We showed that the marginal rate of substitution, U1 over U2, is equal to the ratio of prices, P1 over P2. And of course, once we do that, right, that's our last first order condition. This is I equal to P1 plus P2 x2. Right in there, like that. Okay. So, those are my three first order conditions, and I just proved them when we showed graphically. Right? Now, I want to talk about lambda a little and its interpretation. The Lagrangian multiplier tells us how much the objective function will change if I relax the constraint by 1 unit. In this case, if I give the person $1 more, how much will his utility increase? Or equally, if I take $1 away from him, how much will his utility decrease? That's what the Lagrangian multiplier tells us. So if I have $1, I can buy 1 over P1 units of good 1. Since U1 is a utility I get for spending $1 on good 1, U1 over P1 is the amount of utility I can get by spending the marginal $1 on good 1. Similarly, U2 over P1 is the same amount of utility that I can get by spending a marginal $1 on good 2. And we know those two things, right, from before, right? Right in here, U1 over P1 and U2 over P2. That's basically how much more utility I get by spending an extra $1 on each of those units. So we just saw that in order to really maximize my utility, these two expressions have to be equal. This means that I have to be getting as much satisfaction from spending $1 on good 1 as I am on spending $1 on good 2, right? I might be buying a lot more good 1 than good 2, or vice versa, but the amount of utility that I'm getting per $1 is the same. So lambda can be interpreted as additional satisfaction I would get from additional units of income.
So lambda would be like a shift.
Okay.
Lambda would be, sería interpretada como un shift en esa curva de utilidad, ¿no? Mayor lambda, curva.
See, it's a shift, but it's actually a shift in the budget line, right? So if I shift the budget line, how much more utility do I get? How much, in other words, what new and difference curve am I on when I shift that budget line? I add an extra $1, the budget line shifts, I'm on a new and difference curve. Okay. In general, the Lagrangian multiplier associated with the specific constraint tells us how much more we can achieve in criteria function if the constraint is weakened by 1 unit. So that works for basically any Lagrangian multiplier or any Lagrangian, right? It tells us how much the objective function changes when the constraint changes. So it tells me how much more of the thing that's scarce, the constraint, is worth in terms of what we're trying to achieve. So the process we just described will be standard in attacking most of the problems, at least the first part of the class, right? Because these problems will have a goal that can be described as some real valued function and one or several constraints that can be described as inequalities. Right? Another example, and we're actually going to do this later on, or something similar to this, is if I have a firm, right, that wants to maximize basically profits, price times production, where f of x is our production function, right? So I want to maximize that PF given x underscore overscore greater than x underscore, where f of x underscore is a production function, p is the prices, and x underscore is inputs. To solve the problem, we have the Lagrangian, and the font gets screwed up, but it's usually like that. But anyhow, L PF of X underscore plus lambda with gradient multiplier, X underscore minus X underscore. Then we differentiate with respect to X underscore and set it equal to 0. Now, what this tells us, by the way, the constraint, is there's a maximum amount of inputs that are available. X underscore is that maximum amount. So we differentiate with respect to X underscore and set it equal to 0. So our first order conditions are P times F prime X underscore tilde equals lambda tilde, and tilde X underscore equals X underscore times X underscore. In other words, we're using all our inputs. So the meaning of lambda tilde in this case is additional profit, right? That I can get if I had one more unit of X underscore overscore. In other words, the maximum amount of inputs out there, if that was increased, how much more profit would I get? This is known as a shadow price, right? When we talk about production instead of consumption, right? So basically, it's another unit of inputs. If I can have one more unit of inputs, how much does my profit increase? It's not the price in the usual sense, like it's the price of the input or basically the price of the output. It's basically how much more profit I get when I relax my constraint. In other words, I get one more, in this case, one more unit of inputs. In this case, revenue and profit are the same because I'm assuming no costs from relaxing the constraint and of how much of the input I can use. In other words, I increase my input by 1 unit, my revenue increases by lambda, in this case, lambda tilde. Okay, so here we go. What I'd like you guys to do is take this objective function, write a Lagrangian. Well, you don't really have to because I've done it for you. First I did it generally and I did it with this. And I'm going to assume the price of good 1 is 2. The price of good 2 is 4. And we have 12 units of income. Right now, what I'd like you to do is set up the Lagrangian, or actually just copy it from here, and then do the first order conditions. And, well, the first order conditions are over there. But now instead of P1, P2, you have numbers. Okay. So I take the first order conditions. First, I take the partial Lagrangian with respect to x1, then x2, and then lambda. So here, the partial of the utility function with respect to x1 is going to equal 1/4 x1 to a negative 3/4 x2 to the 1/2. So here, right, I have the negative 3/4. There's just our calculus, 1/4. By the way, if it's easier for you to do with the decimals, you can switch them over to decimals instead of 1/4 and 1/2, 0.25 or 0.5. So U1, so our first order conditions would be U1 minus lambda P1 equals 0, which means I can write it as U1 equals lambda P1 or U1 equals 2 lambda, right? I do the same thing for the second first order condition. I'd get U2, which is the partial of U with respect to x2, which is equal to this, right? Minus lambda P2 equals 0. So therefore I can write, or I can set U2 is equal to lambda P. U2, the partial of U with respect to x2 is 1/2 x1 to the 1/4, U2 to negative 1/2, and that equals 4, which is P2 lambda. And then, of course, our last first order conditions, I set the constraint equal to 0, 12 minus 2x1 minus 4x2 equals 0. So therefore, 2x1 plus 4x2 equals 12. Okay. Now notice I have lambda on the right-hand side on both of them. Exactly. Resuelvo por los lambdas. The first one I divide by 2, second one I divide by 4. Set them equal. And I can resolve for x1 in terms of x2. Okay. So I eliminate lambda. I get well, actually, let's go back. I did it a little differently, didn't I? Okay. So I eliminate lambda. I have the 2/4s, right? So I bring it over, I get 2. Yeah. So I get 1/2 x1 to the 1/4, x2 to negative 1/2, 1/4 x1 to the negative 3/4, x2 to the 1/2. All of that equals 2. Now here is just algebra. I have x1 to the 1/4, x divided by x1 to a negative 3/4. So I have 1/x1 to a negative 3/4, so just x1 to the 3/4. So I have x1 to the 4th times x1 to a negative 3/4. I just have x1. The same thing with x2. X2 I have down here, the 1/2. Up here I have x2 to negative 1/2. X2 to negative 1/2 is 1/x2 to the 1/2. So I bring them down and I get on the denominator x2. And up here I have 1/2 over 1/4. That gives me 2. I divided both by 2. I had 2 on this side already. So I get x1 over x2 equals 1. Right? Now, what I need to do, and I hesitate to do this, I'm not sure if she's here. Yeah, I'm not sure if she's here. So I'm going to go ahead and not place it, but here once I have x1 equals x2, I'm sorry, once I have x1 over x2 equals 1, that means x1 equals x2. And I can just plug them in to our constraint, right? I have 12 is equal to 2 x1 plus 4. It should be x2, but x2 is equal to x1, so I just write it as x1. So I have 12 is equal to 6 x1, or x1 equals 2. And I know x1 equals 2, so I'm sorry, x1 equals x2, and therefore they're both equal to 2. Okay. Therefore, the marginal utility of income, we can write our, excuse me, our Lagrangian multiplier. So I get 1/2 x1 over 1/4 x2 over 1/2, where we can substitute x1 and x2 with 2. Note that lambda can't be negative. If I did that, that would mean that loosening up my constraint would lower my utility, and therefore it wouldn't really be a constraint, right? I'd want to lower my budget to increase my utility. Maybe if you're some Zen master or something, that'll work, but it doesn't work for our assumptions. Let's see. Okay, a quick review of what we've done. The general Lagrangian multiplier technique was as follows. If I want to maximize a utility function, U of x underscore is subject to a budget constraint where I have a bunch of different baskets of goods. I set up the Lagrangian expression. In this case, I have 2. U of x bar, U of x bar plus lambda I minus P underscore x underscore, and this is the vector prices times the vector of goods. I take all the first order conditions, so I'll get UI x tilde underscore minus lambda tilde PI is less than or equal to 0. Most of the time I want to set it equal to 0, but for a constraint for all the i's. For as many baskets of goods, that's how many first order constraints I'll have, plus the last one on the lambda. If any of these equations is less than 0, then x tilde xi has to be equal to 0, because again, we're assuming we can't consume in negative quantities. Okay. I can also write the first order condition as U1 over P1, or do I have one here? U1 over Pi is less than or equal to lambda for all the i's, right? In this case, if Ui over Pi is less than lambda, then xi is equal to 0. That means if our constraint's not binding, right? Then we're not using any of that, so we don't have any 0. For any good we're consuming in positive quantity, lambda can be interpreted as the additional utility that we can get by spending an extra dollar on that good. So you give me an extra dollar, I spend it on that good, that's how much more utility I get. Note that this is a story here where in one period, so savings doesn't give us utility, and we can't borrow. So one period competitive statics model. The results we got here are the same ones that we've seen graphically. When we said that we want to maximize utility subject to a budget constraint, we would end up at the point where the indifference curve was just tangent to our budget constraint. Or in other words, the marginal rate of substitution, right, is equal to the ratio of prices. Okay. What if we have more than one constraint? The example that used in economics for quite a while is coupons. And what I mean by coupons is rationing coupons. For instance, in the United States during World War II, you couldn't buy an unlimited amount of sugar, gasoline. There were a few things that the only way you could buy them is if you not only had the money, but you had the coupons that said they gave you the right to buy them. So here we have a constraint, u of x underscore plus lambda I p underscore x underscore plus 5c minus q underscore x underscore, where q in this case is the amount of coupons you have. In this case, lambda is additional utility that I would get from an additional unit of income, and phi is additional utility that I would get from an additional coupon, right? I can only buy something if I have money and the coupon. I'm restricted to the shaded area over here in the next graph. In other words, instead of having an indifference curve where I just set the budget, now I have two budget constraints or two constraints, and I have to maximize. So I can be anywhere in here, and right there at point C in this case is where I'm going to maximize my utility. Okay. So if my maxima is at point A, the price of coupons is 0. Similarly, if my maxima is at point B, I did not use all my money, but I ran out of coupons. Right, the shadow price of money is 0 at that point, and at point C, we run out of both money and coupons. So even though I could be the richest person in the world, I don't have the coupons, I can't buy stuff. Of course, that doesn't work that way. There's always other markets where you can spend it at higher prices. Okay, so that's basically how we're going to tackle our optimization problems. Right, so we're going to be doing this now for consumer theory, and we'll do it again when we study the okay. Now, so far I've only done the first order conditions. I haven't done the second order conditions, right? Tell us if we're going to maximize. As you said, that I told you most utility functions are kind of, most of the difference graphs look like this, right? We have our diminishing marginal rate of substitution, and that means diminishing marginal utility, and our difference curves are convex or bows inward. However, I can have a difference curve that bows inward and still have a maxima, given my budget constraint. But if I do that, but if I do not have diminishing marginal rates of substitution, I might not have a unique maxima. For instance, suppose I have, here is convex, here is convex, but over here I have a convex, my utility function. I have two maximums in this case. And both of those would maximize my utility, given that budget constraint. But that middle part is troublesome because, right, I have to find that point where at least one of those are on, excuse me, on my highest, on my budget, or each point of my indifference curve is on my budget. Now, suppose I had something like this. In this case, I have two maxima, but this one's clearly preferred to this one, right? Because it's on a higher indifference curve, right? Namely the first order condition, right? That the marginal rate of substitution equals the ratio of prices is necessary, but not sufficient. We need that second order condition, right? In other words, we need the whole thing to be convex. Okay, what happens if I don't have a budget constraint that's linear, like we've been saying? Well, in that case, it really doesn't matter much, as long as the budget constraint is at least concave. That way we can have that tangent to our convex indifference curve. So it can be linear or concave. So if my budget constraint looks like the one below, I'll still have the same first order conditions. The slope of the difference curve must equal the slope of the budget line. The slope of the budget line is still going to give me opportunity costs of one goods in terms of another. So in this case, I'm still looking for the same condition, and as long as they're both mirror each other, one convex, one concave, it'll work. It doesn't have to be linear.
Si es para lineal, obviamente las operaciones no son constantes, van a depender de la cantidad. Es como decir, en términos personales, casi siempre vamos a ser, porque nosotros no influenciamos los precios, pero si es una nación o algo así, que mientras más petróleo compre, pues más va aumentando.
See, it's exact, and we actually get something very similar, except that, como una nación, ¿verdad? You don't get an indifference curve, and since in a nation there's different individuals, right? The assumptions that we have about indifference curves, right, won't work because there's individuals like I have an indifference curve and you have an indifference curve. As a nation, at a certain level, their indifference curve might look like that. But if we go up a little, we change the indifference curve might change. They might actually cross each other. And one of the things that we talked about is that the indifference curve that each one, right, has to give us higher utility. Now, if they cross each other, well, that doesn't work anymore.
Se puede decir como una comprar al por mayor. Si yo tengo dos productos y yo los compro al por mayor, ¿entiendes? Mientras más compre, más barato me sale cada producto. Entonces sería un ejemplo de...
You're saying if they're both convex, los dos...
Tengo dos productos, exacto, tengo dos productos. Tengo producto A y producto B. El producto A lo puedo comprar en Samsung y producto B en Costco, por decirlo más fácil. Producto, mientras más yo compre el producto A, pues hay más descuento me da esa tienda. Okay. Eso sería así con B, de esta formita, profesor.
Sí.
Cóncavo hacia arriba. Convexo.
Okay. Sorry, I have to think about this a second. Okay, so if I get a quantity discount, the more of X2 I consume, the price of X2 decreases. Okay, yeah, that would be convex. And in that case, you don't necessarily get a tangency point. It's possible. The slopes have to be the same. In fact, you might get an indifference curve right on top of the budget line. They're right on top of each other, and therefore it'd be tangent throughout. But that's a rare case, a unique case, and you probably wouldn't get it. You probably get your budget lines with a different slope than your indifference curves, and then they would cross each other, and you wouldn't get an optimal point. So that's one of the reasons we assume fixed price is probably. Okay. Effects of changes in income. Well, basically here, I'm here. I get an increase in income when I'm here, so I move from one point to the next. If I do that a bunch of times, right, I get something like this. If we want to infer something about how demand behavior changes, we alter income constraints and keeping price constants. We have a graph like this. By the way, all of these, since prices are constant, all of these budget lines are parallel to one another. Okay. This figure X1 is measured on the horizontal axis, X2 is measured on the vertical axis. Therefore, we can see that the demand for the goods at each level of income, if we connect all those points, we get our income consumption path or our expansion path, depending. Most texts call it the income consumption path. Associated with that, I can draw something known as an Engel curve, right? Where I have the good on the vertical axis and income on the horizontal axis, and I see the slope. If I have a normal good or a luxury good, right, this is upward sloping. If I have what we call an inferior good that we'll talk about in a little bit, this curve, the Engel curve, would be downward sloping. What that means is I get richer, I buy less of it. Noodles, top ramen noodles. I used to use rice, but Puerto Ricans like rice, so it never worked here. So yeah, top ramen noodles. As I get richer, I buy less of those things. Okay. Okay. Holding prices constant. If we increase the level of income and the consumption of a good increases, we call that a normal good, right? For example, good one in the graph on the left side. However, if income increases and consumption decreases, we call it an inferior good. So in this case, right, our budget line goes up and we actually consume less of a good. That is an inferior good. But of course, in this case, we less a good one, but we consume a lot more of good two. Okay. Some examples of inferior goods are things that keep us alive without spending much. Spam. If our income increases, we switch to a good that we like better and couldn't afford before. And this is something that I took from an old professor of mine, but I always like to throw it in the middle. This is really our first lecture last week was introduction. Note on assumptions. Two people with different assumptions about the way the world works or the way it's set up can look at the same data and come up with wildly different conclusions. We need to remember that assumptions that we make affect the conclusions we reach, even if the data we work with doesn't change. The assumptions we make, as well as the models we work with, affect the conclusions we reach. On the other hand, there's no way of looking at data or facts about the world without having some theoretical model, some way of organizing your data and your thoughts. You have to have some idea of the way things work together and go together in order to be able to make sense of the data you look at. That's just an aside. It's just, I put it here in the first lecture. It's just, you might look at this and come up with a different conclusion. You might come up with a theory, or you can test a theory, right? But somebody else might look at the test and say that you're not testing what you're doing, and the interpretations of your results are different than what you think or what you were testing to begin with. Okay. So the effects of price changes. What I want to do now is I want to see how demand changes when we change the prices. When we change prices. Say we have the price of good one, right? And we let it vary. If we connect all of the tangency points, right, we obtain the price consumption curve. So here, good one, good two, the price stays the same. So therefore the axis, if I spend all my money in good two, right, this is where I'm at, because the price doesn't change. But here, the price is higher for a good one. Here it's a little lower, here a little lower, and then the lowest, right? So I connect those three optimal points, right, at different prices. And below, I depict those prices on the vertical axis, right here. And then I draw a point for the quantity of X1 I consume. So here I consume this much of X1, right, at this price, at the highest price. At a little lower price, I consume this much of X1. And an even lower price, I consume this much of X1. I connect those dots and I get a demand curve. This is our demand curve. If you had an economics class, you had an economics class way back when. It was about a year ago, right?
This is my first question. We were going to have one, but it didn't have before.
Oh, okay. I guess I'm wrong. Sorry. Anyway, we get a downward sloping demand curve, just like you see in Econ 1, but we derived it, right, from our indifference curves and our budget lines. So now I can ask what happens to the demand of good one as I vary the price of good one, holding income and the price of good two constant, as we did. We obtain a demand curve. More specifically, Marshall was, I think, a 16th century economist, basically an old economist So therefore, he gets these named after him. This is a Marshallian demand curve, right? Most of the time when you see this, and nobody gives him credit. So note that this time we have the quantity on the horizontal axis and the price on the vertical axis. Right? And this is our downward sloping demand curve, and this is what we think most demand curves should look like. And just like we talked about last time, right? If I have my demand, my downward sloping demand curve, and I assume an upward sloping supply curve, we get a point where they meet, and we call that equilibrium. We have an equilibrium price, and if we go down here, we'd have an equilibrium quantity, right? And we saw that if price was above the equilibrium price, we'd have excess supply, more being supplied than being demanded. What that means is inventories would build up, right? And eventually the store would have a sale to get rid of that excess inventory. Prices would keep decreasing until we get to a point where there's no more pressure on price to decrease. And the same thing if we're below the equilibrium price, well, the opposite. In this case, we'd have excess demand, more being demanded than being supplied. Stuff would fly off the shelf, right? The business would notice that even if they raise price a little bit, they could still sell all they want or even more. So, and they keep doing that until they get to a point where, right, the inventories are just right. In other words, they're selling all they want to at that point. Okay, and what we just did, right, is known as comparative statics. We take a picture in time where you have excess supply or excess demand, and we see what happens, and then we see where we get to back to equilibrium. Okay. So I want to focus on that equilibrium price as the outcome from the market. We justify it with the following story. If prices are greater than P star, then there would be oversupply or excess supply of the good, and we can push prices down. If it were below, we'd have excess demand and we'd put prices up. But if we didn't have that downward sloping demand curve or an upward sloping supply curve, it wouldn't work. And I'm going to show you here now with an increase or an upward sloping demand curve. In this case, what would happen? Where supply equals demand, we think of as equilibrium. If price was above the equilibrium price, where they two meet, well, then we'd have excess demand. That means stuff would be flying off the shelves, and well, therefore, businesses would want to raise price. And what happens? Well, price keeps going up, and actually, in this case, it's going up forever. Right? If price is below equilibrium, then we'd have excess supply. Stuff was flying off the shelves. I'm sorry, stuff is not flying off the shelves. Stuff is staying on the shelves and not going anywhere. So I lower the price. But what happens when I lower the price? People buy less. So I try lower the price there, and I lower the price all the way to zero, and nobody wants anything. Again, if I have an upward sloping supply curve, and an upward sloping demand curve, this doesn't work. And the same thing is if I have a downward sloping supply curve, it wouldn't work. But is that possible? Is it possible for me to have a downward sloping demand curve? So in this case, in the case that we had before, P0 is still equilibrium, but it's not the price that they converge to. So how do we get a downward sloping demand curve? An upward sloping demand curve. I'm sorry? Not more.
Un producto, alguna marca que se vuelva famosa, entonces suben los precios, subir los precios, más personas la quieren porque es como que te pone más elite y eso va a llegar a un límite, pero...
That was actually one of the assumptions we made. That was actually one of the assumptions that we made at the beginning, that we assumed that people like the good and not just because it's higher price, but that's okay because it's possible. But in general, it doesn't work that well because we have budget constraints. So it might work for an individual, but it wouldn't work as a whole. So have we made any assumptions that allow us to conclude that an individual's demand curve could slope upward? That could be one, what you said. Suppose I have the following case, right? Here I have a good one, and the price increases. As the price increases, I demand less of a good one. Now, what this is going to mean is that the income effect is greater than the substitution effect. And we're going to talk about that next time. Anyway, we're going to talk about that later on in the class. So when the price of good one goes down, I'm relatively richer, so I buy more of good two. And since good one is an inferior good, we talked about, as the price of good one goes down, we become relatively richer and we buy less of it. Imagine that there were two goods, rice and meat. I would get all my food from meat because I really don't like rice. I know it's a bad assumption here, but I really like meat, don't like rice. So I would like all just to eat meat. But meat's too expensive, and if I only try to buy meat, I'd starve to death, right? So I buy mostly rice because I'm poor. So if the price of rice falls, right, I can buy just as much rice as I was before and buy more meat. Or I can even buy a little bit less rice and more meat. Right? Than I did before. I spend all the difference on meat, and I'm better off than I was before on production utility. So in conclusion, I could have, in theory, an upward sloping demand curve if the following is true. If we're dealing with an inferior good, so that really doesn't work for the case of, it wasn't the moda, sorry, right? Where a price goes up and I demand more of it. That's exactly what this is. Oh, you read ahead, huh? Okay. We're dealing with the inferior good. We spend most of our income on it, and there are no close substitutes. So a good whose quantity demand increases, the price increases, called a Giffen good. A Giffen good must be an inferior good, but an inferior good is not necessarily a Giffen good, right? So what are the things we talked about? Our local properties of demand functions. They are descriptions about what is happening to this function at a particular point. For example, a good could be a Giffen good at some prices and a normal good for others. So in other words, you might have a weird looking demand curve where it's upward sloping at some points and then downward sloping. The one example that they give for Giffen goods were potatoes in Ireland in, I think it's the late 18th century, where Ireland had a potato famine. In other words, it was some fungus that got on the potatoes and killed the potato crop. Potatoes are a New World vegetable, but it went to Europe and it became very famous or very popular because it was easy to make. You could grow it pretty much anywhere as long as you had good soil. It didn't, but since it's a root basically, the weather didn't matter. So Ireland, it was perfect for potatoes. They had a fungus that killed off all the potatoes. The price of potatoes went up and people were demanding more potatoes than they were before because basically that's all they could afford. The thing is, I read a paper arguing that it really wasn't a Giffen good. And basically that the demand for potatoes at that point, or the price of potatoes, and the demand, right, had to do more with, the change of price obviously had to do with supply. But that the case that demand increased, right? Or you had an upward sloping demand curve, right? Isn't that strong? Instead, you had a change or a shift in the demand curve and not a movement along the. Is that the example you were talking about a while ago?
No.
Okay. What was the example you're talking about? I've never heard of another example of a Giffen there. Credible.
Okay, so basically, there was an example. I'm trying to look for the country that it was, but basically there was a craze of some tulip, and that there was a country. It was a long time ago.
Oh.
I don't know what century it was.
Uh-huh.
Was on.
Yes.
And they were importing tulips or something like that, and people it was like two colors.
Yeah. I've never heard that as a Giffen. That's a perfect example. We call an investment bubble, where people kept buying tulips just simply because they thought somebody else would pay for them, not because they like tulips, not because they thought but because they thought somebody eventually would pay more for the tulip.
Yeah, but it wasn't kind of, it was sort of like your example, because people would, as the price would go up, people would buy more of it.
Okay.
I'm reading here that.
See, but I mean, I understand what you're saying, but that's not a gift because it's not a fair. Again, that's more the definition of a bubble, because people aren't consuming
Basically a bubble.
But yeah, again, those would be shifts in demand and not the actual demand curve being upward sloping. Okay. Actually, I'm gonna go ahead and show you what I mean by that. So I have demand and supply, I have an equilibrium price. For whatever reason, tulips, people want to invest in more tulips. What happens is demand shifts and you get more demand or more quantity demanded at a given price, but that's because of a shift in demand and not because you have an upward sloping demand. Okay. Oh, that is it. Okay, questions? Okay. I'd have to look, but like I said, most the cases like that, you can argue that it's shifting demand and not demand curve, and they shift due to extraneous circumstances, i.e., the fungus or other stuff being too expensive. Okay. Questions? We started a little late. We still finished at 1. Are there any questions on the class? I'm hoping that this time, let me reflect the right. I was just going to tell her hi and write it, but okay. I will, if there is one time that you guys can't make it, I can do the same thing. I don't know really if it's worth it. I do know that when I did it during the strike a few years ago, that the students seemed to like it. As long as I did it right, I have to remember to do a few things. Sorry, I usually, well, I usually forget, but I'm supposed to lower the volume before I start teaching. Okay. Okay, that's it. Next week, we will, bueno, Eli. El problema es que ella está trabajando ahora y pues no puede darle mucha atención. Se conectó y luego se fue. Y luego apareció aquí y pues se asustó. Okay. Okay. All right. Well, I'm going to stop the broadcast.